Hello all, my name is Amira Armond. I'm the editor of CMMCAudit and the president of Kieri Solutions, which is an assessment organization. And I am thrilled today to interview Jake Williams and have him present on his experience with a DIBCAC high assessment. So Jake, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Amira. So we're going to talk about DIBCAC high assessments and kind of how those things are a preparation for CMMC. So first off, who am I? This is kind of a listing of some of the companies I've worked with in the past. I am currently a student at Auburn Harvard College of Business. I'm a member of the Women in Cybersecurity, Cyber Patriot teacher. So basically, I've been focused on unclassified cybersecurity for a long time here, working in the defense industrial base for over 10 years. And I have recently gone through a DIBCAC high audit and basically wanted to have a chance to share what I've learned with people. And then thought that, with what Amira has been doing on CMMCAudit, that'd be a great place to share this. So if you don't know already, DIBCAC high assessment is basically where the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center comes out and does an audit of how well you're doing in relation to your DFARS 7012 requirements and your 800-171 requirements. So it's 4 to 5 days, them coming out on site, sitting down with you, walking around the building, showing them your physical security side. They're interviewing you. You're showing evidence of all the different things that you're doing. It's basically a very, very in-depth look at your systems. So what does it matter for CMMC? So DIBCAC is auditing companies in the DIB right now for their compliance with the 800-171. CMMC is nothing but another assessment of compliance with 800-171. So the lessons we learned from DIBCAC should translate very well into what's going to happen with CMMC. DIBCAC is also the branch of the government that's auditing C3PAOs as they go through preparation to be able to handle any kind of audit requirements. And the DIBCAC and C3PAOs are working together on their joint assessments. So this is kind of why all this comes together and how DIBCAC plays into CMMC assessments. So what I'm going to talk about is I got a number of lessons learned here, basically things that I've learned from going through the DIBCAC high, from talking with people in the ecosystem, and just want to share a bunch of this stuff out. So first off are the assessment objectives. So this here is a snippet from 800-171 talking about the basic security requirements. So this here, basically, it is only a little bit of the information of what you really need to know in order to be able to do a CMMC or DIBCAC assessment. So you only see these requirements, but there's not detail here on how you have to meet them. And it says in just a little footnote there in 800-171, oh, by the way, look at 800-171A. You may pass it, may not even realize that down in the footnotes, depending on how deeply you read 800-171 and if you've read it about 50 times like I have. So when you open up 800-171, you see these security requirements there and the different assessment objectives. So those in 800-171A, it includes the procedures that colloquially we call the assessment objectives. Also, you can hear them called determination statements. Basically, in order to know that if you've met all of 3.3.1, you got to do all those different things down inside there to actually prove that you've done everything. So it takes the 110 requirements within 800-171 and turns it into 320 assessment objectives.
So Jake, can I pull this back a little bit? Because the presentation is assuming a level of understanding, which hopefully if we're doing CMMC and compliance, we understand this, but I don't know if everybody here gets it. So what Jake's talking about here with these numbers, this 800-171, that is the number of a document that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, published. So they have published many documents. One of them is 800-171. It's just a number, it's an arbitrary number, which is essentially the standards that the government expects contractors to follow for the protection of CUI on their information system. it's a little bit more of an elegant title than that. But so when we say that contractors, defense contractors need to do 800-171, we're basically saying you need to go read that document, do all the things it says for cybersecurity. Then CMMC, that means that a third-party assessor is going to come in and double check that you're actually doing those things. And 800-171A, A for assessment or audit, is the instructions for that third party to assess whether you're doing 800-171A. So it gets a little bit more granular and it has specific questions the assessors have to ask. All right, thank you. Back to you.
You bet. Yeah, I'm assuming a level of understanding here, which may not be for everybody. So the next thing I want to do is kind of talk about there within those assessment objectives is looking at specific keywords to help you figure out what they're trying to do. So you see there, I have that yellow box talking about defined, identified, specified. So those assessment objectives are places where they're going to want you to have something written out. So you should have that in your SSP, which is your system security plan, or in a separate policy. So you want to have those things defined. So if you are saying, you know, the content of audit records there in 331B needs to be defined, you got to say somewhere, hey, this is what my audit records are going to have in them. And similarly in the blue box, when you have such words as authorized, created, that is where you want to talk about what things you're going to be expecting to show as evidence when it comes time to do an assessment. So if you have a definition that says, hey, I am going to create these audit records in 331B, then 331C says audit records are created. So you have a policy saying I'm going to do it, and then you have to show, hey, I'm actually doing it. So it's not too hard to follow along here. Basically, they tell you what they want you to do, and then they say, we're going to actually check that you are doing this. And so as you're going through the assessment objectives, these hints here with the yellow and blue can give you an idea of on each objective, is it something I need to write down and have a policy for, or is this going to be something where I'm going to need to show it to them either live or in screenshots? So the next lesson we have is, what is the role of a system security plan? What do they want to see in there? So this here, 312.4, is the requirements for a system security plan from 800-171. So when you talk to DIBCAC and likely a CMMC assessor, they're going to request a network diagram and an overview of your environment. What your SSP should do is it should be kind of telling a story of your compliance. So C and E there are things that are required for them to understand your environment. But besides just C and E, you want to kind of answer the questions for them. So if they have questions like, you know, are you a Mac shop? Are you a Windows shop? Are you on premise or in the cloud? Your SSP should kind of fill all that information in for them already. They should have a really good understanding from sitting down and reading your SSP of what your company looks like and what they're going to be expecting to have to review. Your SSP also should really help guide your discussions. So it should have enough answers in there that they don't have to keep digging for questions. And I can tell you from a being audited perspective, you definitely don't want to leave it open-ended for auditors. You want to kind of guide them into the answer. Say, okay, I know what the question's going to be. Here's the answer to your question already. Because the less questions they have to ask, the easier it is to kind of to move on through there. So some of the requirements in your SSP are there listed. You know, your system boundary in B. Any deviations that you have are approved and documented, and we'll talk about how that works out in the DoD world, because right now this is basically used by the Department of Defense. That's where we're talking about it, although other departments in the future may have different ways to deviate. Documenting external connections. So if you are connecting to a partner, to a prime, or to a cloud provider, you want to have those documented in there. Other things that I recommend you have in your SSP. So if you have a revision history listed in there, so that's G&H. If you say in there, hey, we have to update this SSP at least once per year. and then you have a revision history in there, you can prove through the revision history, hey, we are looking at this at least once a year. If you have a simple revision history table, it's so easy just to mark off G and H as done. It's almost, it's really easy to do that. And I'll show you some examples in the next few slides of roles and responsibilities and policies and procedures that I put into mine that, again, helped kind of guide things. So beside an audit standpoint, it also helps it helps with the roles and responsibilities to make sure that you know who it is in your company that is responsible for answering those questions. So say you change from an on-premise Exchange server to a cloud-based one. Well, if you look at your roles and responsibilities, then you can say, all right, so these people in my company need to go help me rewrite my system security plan. So talking about my SSP specifically, mine was 81 pages long. I've heard examples anywhere from like 10 pages to 500 pages. I'm not saying anything is right or wrong, but this was what worked for me to get through the DIBCAC audit. Had about 20,000 words. A couple additional things we had our AUP, our acceptable use policy, and so that covered a lot of technology stuff in it. What people are and are not allowed to do. So that was something that we would require employees to read and sign off on, when they started the company and anytime we had major changes to it. We had a policy manual, which was basically internal IT policies. So when we are setting up a new system, these are the logs that we require from that. These are how we do vulnerability scanning, those kinds of things. So we had different policies and procedures in there. We had 14 policies and it was 37 pages long. And then finally, we have an employee handbook, which references a lot of our physical security requirements as far as being required to have a badge on, required to check in, check out visitors, things like that. So there below that, that's an excerpt of my actual system security plan in 311. So we talk about whether it's met, partially met, or not met, talks about the technology we're using. This is where we talk about the roles and responsibilities there. So anytime we had any kind of changes to this, those are the people that we'd have to go talk to, or that I would say, if we haven't updated this section in a year, send it over to them and say, hey, is this still up to date? And then the connection there to our policies and procedures and processes.
So can I ask a couple questions about the SSP?
Absolutely.
So I get asked regularly, how should I scope my SSP? Should I write my SSP to cover everything in my entire environment? Should it cover my public website? Should it only be the systems that actually have CUI on them? How would you recommend that? Should there be one SSP for each server, for example, or for each application?
So I have one SSP that covers my entire environment. So the company I'm at, we do about 90% of our work is Defense Department work. So it's really everywhere. Any system that we have in the company may have some CUI data on it. It's possible to do some enclaves, to do some segmentation off. I worked at one company that had an international presence. So our system security plan only covered our US side. And then we had some information there about how we kept the, other countries from accessing the information there. And then you can also do a little enclave even within your company where you say, well, we're not doing 100% defense work, so let's pull that off separately. To me, that's kind of something you can't answer without understanding the business really well. The question for me is, where does your data flow? Do you bring stuff in via email that everybody has? Is it put on a file server? Are you controlling access to it really easily? And those are the kind of things where you have to determine how you're going to keep systems from getting CUI or getting access to CUI to determine how you may want to scope it down some.
So it sounds like you're saying that in general, it's safe to talk about a segment of your network if you have good boundaries, which keep that network separate from other things. Is that correct?
That is correct. So I've actually been through 2 DIBCAC high assessments with different companies. The first time we had it segmented, so we had just a segment of our company that was that was slated to handle CUI, and they had a lot of questions on, okay, so how are you keeping this data from getting to everything else? We had to show the firewall protections we had in place. We had to show all the different controls we had, so to be able to get inside the CUI enclave, but not pull that data out in an unapproved fashion.
Excellent. And last question, and I guess you've done this twice, so there might be different questions, but when you chose the scope for what you talked about in your SSP, or DIBCAC chose the scope of their assessment, how was that picked?
So for DIBCAC, they told us, hey, here are these contracts that you have, and we want to see how you are protecting the data on those contracts. They would pick generally 3 contracts that were active, that had CUI on them, that they were interested in. There's some dark magic involved that they refuse to share on how they pick which companies get assessed. But we basically looked at it, and the answer was we didn't do these contracts separately. So it's not like based on the way that our company works, we don't segment off each different contract because we have just a large number of them together. So we determined basically it was easiest to answer those contracts from an enterprise point of view.
Well, thank you.
Yep. And the only other thing I wanted to say on this page is on the right-hand side, there's kind of an example of what the index looks like for mine. So, we start with, we have a certification basically where it's signed off by a senior member of the team. We have our revision history, then we kind of have our overview, and then it goes down into some of the details and then into each individual control in there. Now, there's nothing saying this is how you have to do it. This was the template of the SSP that I inherited, and it works great, but there is no one way that you have to do it as long as you are kind of answering all the questions there. A lot of flexibility. All right, so the next lesson I'm going to talk about is proving what you say you do. So like I said before, make sure you have a written policy everywhere that there is one of those defined, identified, or specified. And like I said, those can be in your system security plan or a separate document. So for myself, I had 3 separate documents. My system security plan is the high-level overview of the company and how we're meeting everything. This is something that not everybody would be looking at. This is what we'd show an assessor. This is what we'd kind of talk about at a high level in the IT management side as far as the overview of what we're doing. Our IT policy manual would be the set of the manuals, the set of not exactly processes, but some of the policies that we would give to the different people within IT. So, if we had a server administrator, he'd use some of these in the policy manual to determine how he was supposed to set that up. And then the other one's the acceptable use policy, which everybody in the company has to sign off on. So it's basically different documents for different audiences. There's no reason for everyone in the company to have to read your SSP on a regular basis. If you put all the acceptable use policy there within your SSP itself, then anytime you change your acceptable use policy, you've got to do a revision of it. You've got to have everybody sign off on it. And then also, besides those 3 things, I also had a number of procedures that we had to follow. So written procedures as far as if there is an exception to a policy, because your policy is only as good as your exception process. And then so we had to actually have some process for if someone requested an exception from a policy, we would have specific procedures we'd follow to approve or disapprove that exception and put and document it and put those exceptions in place. HR procedures.
Can I
yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, so that sounds very interesting, the exceptions to policy, because we've kind of been told no POAMs or various other things of that sort. But then we've got this weird little middle area where there's temporary deficiencies that can be documented and put in your plan of action, and that's okay, kind of sometimes. So how did that work? Did you go through your DIBCAC assessment with systems that weren't completely meeting say one of the requirements, or was it a case where you were meeting the minimum, but your policy was a higher bar, so you let them be in that in between? How did that work?
So both of them. So the exceptions to policy, with some of our subcontractors that we're working on, or we're subcontractors to other companies, they require us to VPN into their systems. So our policy is that you're not allowed to install VPN software other than the corporate approved software. However, because of some of our contracts, we have to give a limited set of people in our company exceptions to the policy of no VPNs. So that is where that is the exception to policy we have in place, where we basically we had to make specific exceptions to some of our policies in order to do the work. Now, as far as limited deficiencies, POAM items, I'll actually talk a little bit about limited deficiencies when I get to the FIP side. So yeah, we had a number of limited deficiencies on our POAM because I treat my POAM as a true living document. So, I'll give you an example. We were switching from one AV vendor to another during the middle of the assessment. It just happened to turn out at that point. And so we talked about our old AV vendor and our SSP, and then on our POAM, we said, look, we are changing from this old one to the new one. So there's going to be some systems in place where we are testing the new one, getting it ready. And then we have a POAM item that's a temporary finding or temporary deficiency that we are going to change everything in the SSP and change how we're doing things over to this new AV vendor. So that is a place where it wasn't an exception to policy, but it was a temporary deficiency on the POAM.
So there's a lot of confusion about the POAM out there because, again, especially with the CMMC program, we had people saying you cannot have a POAM, you cannot have something that's not implemented fully, you will fail. But part of the actual requirements from NIST Special Publication 800-171, it actually says you have to have a POAM. You have to be documenting your temporary deficiencies and have a plan for fixing them. And so I kind of think of it as capital P POAM versus lowercase p POAM, where the lowercase p is for your everyday stuff that you're working through, where capital P is you are completely not performing one of the requirements, and that's bad. But you should be allowed to have the normal definition of a POAM, which is something's not right, or you're migrating, or you're making a change, or even you're trying to improve over time.
Exactly. And I don't have an example of my POAM to show you here, but we did have a category in there for a permanent deficiency, whereas yes, we are failing this at this point. We are not doing the minimum versus a temporary deficiency, which is where we are doing the minimum and we're changing it or we want to improve it, any of those kinds of things. And so the POAM was not just a compliance requirement, it was also a way for us to show improvements over time in our cybersecurity posture. So the other two procedures I got listed here, HR procedures. So HR has specific procedures that they follow for onboarding or offboarding or transferring employees, and those tie into some of the 800-171 requirements. So we had to show those kinds of procedures in place, and the reason for the procedure is just to make sure that we are consistently doing it. We don't have somebody leave the company and 6 months later we find out that their account has been active and they've been logging in the entire time. And then also training. So where there's training requirements, we have procedures to follow, such as the acceptable use policy, where when somebody comes on board the company, they have to get this specific training along with other training that we require. And then we have procedures that we follow to do that. And then for the things that do not have the written kind of, policies or procedures, you have to have evidence for it. So you may have screenshots or some exports or some logs. So 323 is talking about you have to do security awareness training on insider threat. So for us, we basically have, we have a log of everybody who's taken training. So we either have that, written down in a logbook. If you got a real small company, you could be using, a training program, some kind of training software, or you just do an export of a report out of there. Historical artifacts. So, there's a requirement to test your incident response capability. So we had basically every time we do an incident response test, we will go ahead and write up kind of, what our findings were, how it went, timing, that kinds of things. So we provided to them, hey, here's an artifact, here's kind of proof that we actually have been doing this incident response testing. And then there's other times you might have to do a live demo. So the audit record reduction. So we use a SIM. So they wanted us to log into the SIM and say, hey, pull a report showing that you're actually still getting logs in there. So screenshots are great, but that could just be a point in time kind of thing. So that was an example where they actually had us log in and show them that we were still doing everything that we said we were. All right, this next one I know is a favorite of Amira, and there any overlap between what she's posted before and what I've written here is perfectly coincidental. But a risk assessment is not a gap assessment. So if you look in 311.1, you're assessing risk to your organization. And then there I got highlighted in yellow: threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood and impact, including risk from external parties. We hear a whole lot about, third-party risk at this point. If you do a gap assessment of 800-171, see where you are and are not meeting things, that is not a risk assessment. That is completely different. So many companies have a risk management process, so reach out, in your company, say, do we have a formal way of that we are categorizing risks, that we're determining likelihood and impact. So, some companies will do like a 5-point scale or a 3-point scale. So that's what I've done in the past. I've basically just said, okay, what does it look like to the rest of the company when they're looking at risk? And then I'll do a risk assessment of cybersecurity based on that. And NIST has another document, 830, that talks about risk assessments. CIS has one, their risk assessment methodology called the SysRAM, or even as easy as looking at the NIST CSF and kind of comparing the requirements there to what you're doing is a way that you can prove that you've done a risk assessment.
I'm over here laughing because I've been doing this series of the top 10 failed requirements, and one of them is this 311.1 perform a risk assessment, and it flabbergasted me when I saw it, because many small companies can do this risk assessment in about 3 hours from start to finish if they know what they're doing. It's not that hard. It's so much easier than almost all the other requirements, yet it's been a failing one. And I'm pretty sure it's because there's 3 things that people confuse together. They confuse this idea of a risk assessment, which is very similar to like the assessment you might do in a disaster recovery plan of, could a hurricane hit us? How bad would that be? Could our building burn down? How bad would that be? They confuse that sort of risk assessment with a vulnerability scan, which is you're checking to see if your systems need patches, essentially, which is a very automatic, computer-driven task. And then the third thing they confuse it with is this gap assessment, where you're seeing whether you're actually compliant with the requirements. So anyways, yeah, this is a big misunderstanding. So I'm glad you're talking about it, Jake.
Yep, it's a misunderstanding, but it's one of those ones, like you said, it doesn't take too long to sit down and do some kind of risk assessment and document that you've done it. All right, next one is the old discussion on an NA. Where can I decide something's not applicable? So it's actually very clear in the regulations. So the DFARS 7012 tells you if you think something's not applicable, you have to talk to the DoD CIO, and they have to agree with you that something's not applicable. So if you believe that it's not necessary based on your scope, if you believe that you've met the control through alternative measures, so we don't have to do this because we're doing something else. And then there's something called the DoD procurement toolbox, the DoD toolbox, that has a large FAQ, so a bunch of questions and answers there that they update on a irregular basis. So in that toolbox, it reinforces that, yes, if you want a not applicable, you have to talk to the DoD CIO. And the DoD toolbox goes into even deeper explanation there. So if an organization does not allow the circumstances by policy or process, there's no need to request that it's not applicable. Your policy or process that doesn't allow it is considered an implementation. So what I like to talk about here is that if you already meet the requirement through a policy or a process or procedure, don't say that it's not applicable, say it's met, because you will have the same amount of discussion with an auditor explaining why it's not applicable as you will explaining why it's met. But a not applicable is kind of a, oh, wait a minute, why do you say it's not applicable? It's a little more of a question mark or a red flag than a met would be. So some examples here, protect wireless access using authentication and encryption. If you say, you know, our scope is so small that it doesn't include wireless access, then you're meeting it by not having wireless in place. It's not that it's not applicable, it's met by a policy of not having wireless. Control connection of mobile devices. Don't allow mobile devices, then you are meeting it right there. If you have no way for a mobile device to connect, if you're blocking it from connecting, it's already meeting it. Same with encrypting CUI on mobile devices and mobile computing platforms. All you have are desktops, you know, no laptops there, no mobile phones. It's already met there. You don't have to say that it's not applicable. And I gave this presentation. One of the people in the audience for one of the times I gave this presentation was the guy that actually answers the questions if you email the DoD CIO, and he was in the audience with his big grin and just nodding his head up and down the whole time I was talking through this slide. I don't know of anybody who's actually been able to get the DoD CIO to agree that something's not applicable, but instead they will tell you, yeah, you've met this by putting these policies and procedures in place.
Just to second that, absolutely agree. So on the screen, we've got two references out to more information, the DFARS 7012 clause and then the DoD Cyber FAQ toolbox. If you go to CMMCAudit.org, the front page has got links to all the official sources, and there's links to those on the very front page. The DoD toolbox especially is dozens of pages of really good FAQ that are very granular. What do I do in this situation? What do I do in that situation? And that is considered authoritative guidance from the DoD, which assessors should respect.
Yep. Next one, FIPS certifications. This is another one of those giant issues that have been found in a lot of DIBCAC audits. So it says there, employ FIPS validated cryptography, okay, when used to protect the confidentiality of CUI. FIPS validated means that you have to go to the NIST CMVP, the Cryptographic Module Validation Program, and look up the program, look up the vendor, whatever you're using in there. So if you see something from a vendor that says, oh, we are FIPS compliant, or oh, we are FIPS approved, that doesn't mean anything. Those are marketing words that they put out there to try to tell you that their stuff is good enough. If it's not validated, it's not good enough in the eyes of the DoD. So the other thing here is in the DoD assessment methodology. So that is where you actually go in to determine where you've met things. And I assume that also is linked at the front of CMMC audit. So in there, it says if you had a system that was validated and then there was an update later on. So say you're running Windows 10 and you're on a valid version, and then there's an update to Windows 10. But that update has not yet been validated. According to the DoD themselves, that is considered implemented. You put it on your POAM as a temporary deficiency that we were talking about earlier. So this is one of those cases where you have an entry on your POAM saying, hey, we understand that the current version of Windows 10 is not validated, but yet we don't want to stay behind. We don't want to be on old versions. We put that on there as this is temporary. We are using the current version because it is more secure. And then once it gets validated again by NIST, then we'll be all set. And the other thing here that I have is an example from our SSP. I can tell you what we've done in here as far as the FIPS compliance requirement. We went through, we mapped all of our applications that the applications, software, hardware we had in use that were protecting the confidentiality of CUI, and we looked up every single NIST certificate in there. The auditors absolutely loved this because it was a whole lot easier for them than to go and look up these certificates and be able to corroborate what we were saying as far as the validity of the FIPS cryptography, along with what we were doing, instead of them having to go look these things up or have us provide those later. And that was a lesson learned from the first time I went through a DIBCAC high audit. They asked to see a list of all these. So having this all available ahead of time makes it a whole lot easier on an auditor.
I was going to mention that the fact that you've got the certificate numbers, which you can then go to the NIST Cryptographic Module Validation Program database, you can actually type in NIST CMVP into Google and find it. That's huge. With my own programs, when I'm working with clients, I recommend that you want to identify each data flow that you're protecting or each place you're storing the CUI that you're protecting it, and say, for this VPN connection, we're using this certificate. For this storage, we're using this one. But the key is actually diving in to actually find the certificate. If you're talking to a vendor and they say we're FIPS compliant, and they can't give you a certificate number, that's a really bad sign. I'll definitely echo that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a bunch of information that I couldn't share in our SSP as far as like where, our boundary and our diagram and stuff that calls out a lot of these different things. So we have more information than just this on how we are doing it. All right, next. What is required other than 800.171? So when DIBCAC comes out, they give you this whole kind of matrix here. So you see that the second box there is the NIST 800.171 requirements. There's a lot of other stuff that you are required to do that people don't think about because all they think about is 800.171 and CMMC. Now, is CMMC eventually going to come out and audit some of this? I don't know. I'd love to see at least 412, the cyber incident reporting, which is where you're required to have a certificate and a token in order to report incidents. That was something we had to prove to them during this as part of our incident response part. They checked that we actually were able to log in to a government website, and if we had to do an incident report, we knew how to do it. So will you see this in a CMMC audit? Not sure, but these are other things that you should be at least aware that are required as part of 7012.
Yeah, I don't have much more intel on that side. For the C3PO assessment that my company went through, which is a little bit closer to that final CMMC assessment, what that might look like, they didn't ask us about half of these questions. So for example, they didn't ask us the cloud computing services as per 7010 because we don't have that clause in our C3PO contract. But they did assess some of these as part of the 800.171 controls, or requirements. So for example, the external cloud service requirement, I think they assessed that as part of the requirement 3.1.20, which said to control and limit and verify connections to external systems. For the cyber incident reporting, when we got into the requirements for have a capability to do incident response, and I demonstrated our ability to get to that website, they seemed very happy about that. So yeah, none of us are really sure how this is going to go, but it does make sense that CMMC will include at least some of these.
Yep. All right, last one is that sometimes you may come out of this either from DIBCAC or from CMMC with some things that are other than satisfied. So a requirement that DIBCAC feels that you are not meeting would be other than satisfied. The great thing is that when you're talking to DIBCAC, they're going to say, okay, here's why you did not satisfy this. This is a good time to kind of get some insight from them on, okay, so you don't think we did this. What are we missing here? What do we have to do to make it satisfied? It'll give you an idea of, where they see issues. And they also, DIBCAC also had given out some official observations, so they weren't officially findings, like they couldn't fail us on a requirement, but they also wanted to see us do things differently. So we had some official observations as a result of ours. And DIBCAC also gives you a 14-day business period to provide evidence that was unavailable. So this does not mean that if you have something other than satisfied, you can fix it within 14 days, because that's not what they're looking for. It's in an example of, oh, I didn't realize you were looking for that. Let me go gather that information and get it to you. So that's kind of what they're looking for. So there's times where you may have done something, but you didn't understand exactly what they were asking for, or maybe the right person wasn't around to give it to them, and you can get that evidence to them later. So CMMC is going to have a fixed remediation period. We don't exactly know what things are going to look like yet. There's rumors that they're going to allow POAMs for some 1-point things, and until the rules are finalized and out there, we won't know exactly what those are going to look like.
I've got a ton of questions. I don't know if you're ready for them though.
On this or overall?
Some on this. Okay, so I guess on this topic, during your assessment, which was probably something like a Monday through Friday thing, did you ever have a case where during your interview you realized that your SSP didn't explain what you were doing correctly? What did they tell you to do about that? Did they just ignore the SSP? Did they say to rewrite the SSP?
It would be a finding on that day. So they have what they call a hot wash at the end of every day, where they go over, okay, these are the controls we discussed today. They had a list of 110 controls, and they would flag it either with white, as in they hadn't decided yet. It was green, as in they had passed us all the way, or I think red was a complete fail, and yellow was like, hey, we've passed some, we've failed some, we're not certain how this is going to end up yet. So what I would do at the end of every day is I would go back and I would take my SSP with the notes that I had from that day, from my meetings with them and the hot washes, and I'd update my SSP. I'd gather additional information for them. And then by the next morning, I'd provide them an updated copy of the SSP saying, okay, you're right. I was missing this statement in my SSP. I'm doing it. We showed that we were doing it, but it was lacking the definition side. So then I would go in, I'd add the definition in there and send it back to them the next day. I have to say, with the DIBCAC people, it was always extremely collaborative. It worked really well. They were there to try to improve, our cybersecurity. We said, oh, hey, you're right. We forgot to define this in the SSP. They're like, okay, well, go fix it before the end of this week, and we can give you a green on that one. And so that's what we did every night. We'd go back and do that. Similar to that, there was something that they found was other than satisfied. They didn't like the way we were doing something. We disagreed with them, but we understood where they were coming from. So we actually went through our change management process, and we made the change that they had asked for, and we instituted it within the week that they were there. So we actually showed them, hey, here's where we put the request into our change management process. Here's where it was approved. Here's where we actually went and made the change. And then here's where I changed the SSP. And they let us make that change during the week. It was not a major finding. It's not like, oh, we weren't doing vulnerability scanning. It's not like we were totally not doing something. It was a minor improvement they wanted to see on one of our categories. And so we went and changed it. And they were very happy about that.
Now, was that a technical change that you made?
That was a technical change. So they wanted us to use a separate account for something instead of using the same account for two different services. They wanted us to set up a separate account for it. So we did. We put the change management process in. We created the accounts. We made the technical changes to use the new accounts and lock out the old ones. And basically, we were able to do all that within 24 hours and show them proof that we had changed it.
How did they handle if you had a document issue? Say you had a policy or a procedure that they didn't like. Did they let you fix that during the assessment?
So it depended on exactly what needed to be done. So during that 14-day period, we had showed them a number of policies that were still in draft mode. They had not yet been published. So we had drafted them, we had made changes to them, but they weren't published. And during that 14-day business period, we officially published them. We made them available to everybody. And then we were able to show that, yes, we took what we had in draft form and we finalized it between that period. And they were okay with the fact that it was a draft, and then we made it final afterwards, because we knew we'd have a couple findings, policy issues that we needed to correct. So we hadn't completely updated them all, and they allowed us to do those kinds of policy changes.
So you had, I actually missed the opportunity to ask this. This was several slides ago. You had a slide that talked about wherever it says to identify or define or specify something, you have it written down. Did they, trying to think, did they have any process or anything that they required you to go through for that? Or was it just update it and resubmit it?
Update it and resubmit it. So we didn't use like our change management process to make changes to our system security plan or our like policy documents or anything like that. So since we didn't have an official in our SSP, we didn't have to do the change management side for policy changes. It was okay just to go ahead and update those and make the change there.
Now for the second part, where you're actually needing to control it or limit it or whatnot, did they ever just let you say, oh, it says in policy, I'm going to do it, therefore it's good? Did they ever let, because I've got some clients that would like to know if they can just write it in policy and pass. What was your take?
You're going to have anything that's written down in policy, you're going to have to prove somehow that you are doing it. So I mean, if your policy says, don't open any emails that have CUI in them, you're gonna have to prove how you're doing something like that. So you can get away with some policy statements if they are easy to do and prove that you're doing them. I probably have to have some kind of example. I don't know if I have any good examples of where we were doing policy things instead of having a technical control in place. It's very hard to do all this just through policy, though. You do have to have some technical controls in place to stop people from doing the things they're not supposed to.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. For the evidence that they were looking for, did you have any situations where DIBCAC gave you an other than satisfied because there wasn't evidence that they were looking for? Maybe you thought that you had done it, but they wanted to see something else?
Yes, absolutely. I could tell you that. I'll tell you the number one example of that one. There's a requirement in there that before you post stuff on your public website, you are checking it to make sure it does not have any CUI on it, and that you are reviewing your public website on a regular basis. The public website for my company is extremely limited. There's very, very little data out there. And we have a very strong process to go through before you post things on there. But we were not going through and reviewing our website on a regular basis. And they said, this is the finding. we had to come back to them, after that 14-day period. So it ended up as an official POAM, a permanent deficiency, that we were not reviewing our website often enough to show that there was not any CUI on it. And so we basically had our one of our executives go through the website, look at the technical documents we had on there, make sure they didn't have any CUI, and then write up a document that says, yes, on this date, I went through our website and confirmed we don't have any CUI on it. So even though we had a policy in place that, prevented it from happening, we still had to go through and do a review of it afterwards.
Yeah. Let's see. So for a little bit more on evidence, with my C3PO assessment by DIBCAC, one of the things they sent us it was after the scoping call, but before the assessment, they sent us a spreadsheet that basically had every control and assessment objective listed, and it had kind of some notes of what they might expect to see. And there was a lot of references to, say, NIST Handbook 162, which is no longer great guidance, but it has stuff like, for this one, you might want to check to see if you have passwords, for example. And that spreadsheet was very helpful to me getting ready for my assessment, because it made me realize, not necessarily reading the examples, but it made me realize I had to come up with something for basically every assessment objective. Did they provide you anything like that? Did they give you the same spreadsheet that we got?
To the best of my knowledge, what I got was not the same as the C3PAO candidates got. So there is. I can find the link and send it to you to make sure it's on the CMMC audit site. But there is a link that there's a set of documents they send you, but it's like one of them has to do with, okay, so where is your building? How do we get into it? Where do we park? That kind of information. And then just another one that's a basic spreadsheet of, what are your locations that we're evaluating in this, and what are the contracts? But as far as deep detail on what they're looking for, they did not give us any of that.
So I know that DIBCAC is rightfully proud because they got an update to the DCMA website, which I think is dcma.dod.mil, something like that, where if you actually drill down and find the DIBCAC team page, it has some forms and information that you can download to prepare you for what you will see during an actual assessment. And that's very, very useful. The link to it, again, is on the CMMCAudit.org website. Pretty easy to find. I think it's on the front page too. When you were putting together evidence for submission, did they ask you to submit it to the SAFE web portal? Okay,
yes, we did. Yep.
Okay, so that's a really
that
standard
the same.
thing.
Yeah, we had to put it through.
Did they tell you to label each piece of evidence with a specific naming scheme?
I am 99% positive that they did. Yeah. So they had their own way that they wanted to be able to track all this, and that included, the DIBCAC. Each assessment they do has a year dash number. So, we were like, 22 dash, I don't remember what the number was, like 22-15 was the number that we had. And so all of our pieces of evidence, we're supposed to have that in the name, so they could refer back to them.
What I remember was we were asked to basically identify the exact requirement ID, 3.1.1, the assessment objective, A, B, C, whatever, as well as the date that the evidence was collected. Now, that for us, we didn't do that for like policies or the system security plan. We didn't do it for the big stuff that was referenced by a lot of different things. But if we say export a report, or we had our records from doing maintenance, we had to change the file name to match that naming scheme for DIBCAC.
Yep,
Which
we
took
did
a
the
while.
same. Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely took a while to gather all the evidence and get it in the names that they wanted, and then, I tried to have it organized by, like, which family it was in. The 3.1 or 3.2, so it was easier to drill down into it and find the data.
All right, I'll wait until you get to the next slide to ask more questions.
Next slide is just my contact info. So there's my email. Crazy enough to put my cell phone out here, and then my LinkedIn as well. So this is a way for people, if they have questions, they can continue to reach out to me. Try to be very active on LinkedIn. And kind of give advice. Open to DMs, questions, anything like that. Got a question? Tag me in a post. I'll try to get in there and kind of give you some answers.
Yeah, definitely. I'll second that. Jake is one of the people leading the charge on LinkedIn, trying to inject some rationality to this process. Maybe through some very pointed LinkedIn posts here and there.
Yes, and I am somebody who's in this field. I work for companies. I don't, I'm not a consultant. I'm not a salesperson, anything like that out there. I'm here just to make this, make everybody more secure and make things a whole lot better, in the whole ecosystem. And so I'll give you some fairly straight answers.
Mm-hmm. So just a couple more questions.
Yep.
We've been talking about how DIBCAC does their assessments. Do you think that they're basically, I might get us in trouble. Do you think that they're basically doing a good job? Are they a model that C3POs should follow?
As far as how they worked with us, the different organizations out there, I think so. I think they were doing a really good job. They were willing to explain why they felt something was incorrect. We had what I like to call spirited disagreements. They were trying to do their job, we were trying to do ours, and we had to explain to them, hey, we understand where you're coming from, but we're meeting the standard by doing it this way. And we both just kind of had to meet each other in the middle and say, all right, well, we disagree that this is a big deal, but it's going to take us 5 minutes to fix and change, and it's really not going to cause a problem. Okay, we'll make the change. And then other things that were larger deals that they wanted us to change that would have caused problems the way we work. We explained to them, we meet the requirements that are listed there in 800-171. We may be doing it different than other companies, and everybody does come around this different. But we're still doing what is the minimum requirements. Overall, I thought the people were great. I got a chance to actually see some of them in person about half a year later. And there were no apples or oranges or anything being thrown at each other. We were all very cordial. Now, I think DIBCAC has a good idea of what they're doing, and I'm hoping that the CMMC process, as it gets through rulemaking and the C3POs get a little better guidance, it is, there is that leeway, that flexibility allowed to be able to make things as easy as possible.
Did you mentioned that your DIBCAC team was willing to explain what was wrong and even give some ideas on making it better, or something of that sort. And from the assessor standpoint, we're all so afraid of introducing a conflict of interest by saying the wrong thing. We're so afraid that we might not even say this is normally handled with a policy, because we might give you the idea to have a policy, right? And that would be terrible. Were they how did they approach that? Were they a little bit more congenial than you might expect from the CMMC assessors? Were they willing to explain how they saw other companies do it? How did they explain what was wrong?
So they didn't talk much about what other companies had done, but they did get into details on, okay, so you're not doing this thing. What we would like to do is see you do it different by doing this. So like the example of the different account that I brought up. They said, okay, here's what we want you to do in order to pass this. And in my opinion, if an assessor is going to say you aren't meeting a requirement, they should have the ability to say, if you change it to do this or like that, here's how that would make it so you would pass. I think that does not get to the heart of the conflict of somebody, telling someone how to pass, because an assessor should be able to say, all right, well, this is a finding, and if you change it around some, you can pass it. I think there has to be some leeway there for the C3PAOs to have those kinds of discussions and say, oh, you're missing a policy here. Write a policy that says you can't do this. Any of those things I think should be allowed.
Now you said that you had 2 assessments with different companies, and I think you said you had one in 2022.
Yeah, that was my most recent one.
Wowie. Okay, that is recent. How did you have any cloud services that you had to show a shared responsibility matrix or demonstrate that you were doing customer responsibilities for? What did they expect for that?
They did not expect too much from that. So we were using fairly standard, cloud services, AWS GovCloud, Azure and Microsoft GCC High, so things they were very familiar with at that point. So they did not have a lot of questions as far as the shared responsibility goes. Now, if you're using something that has maybe a little less, a little less common usage, and then I think they may have a little more questions. So we did have to talk to them about how we had a shared, the shared responsibility matrix and understood what our requirements were.
Mm-hmm. For my company, we were using Microsoft 365, like many companies, and we were told by our lead assessor from DIBCAC that they need to see how we are performing each of the customer responsibilities for Microsoft 365. And there's various ways you can do that. You can write a free-form document. You can take their shared responsibility matrix and add another column and write down what you're doing on each one. You could, update the product placement, for example. That's very specific to Microsoft. But they did seem to think that was very important for the CMMC assessment that we got, where if the service said you have to say use a certain port or have it configured a certain way, that we were doing that. But that's a big area where there seems to be, I don't know whether it's confusion or whether they're expecting a lot from some people and very little from others. Do you have any thoughts or wisdom on that? What would you recommend companies do if they're using an external cloud? Should they go out and find a shared responsibility matrix for their assessment as evidence?
I absolutely think so. I think that any cloud provider, if they are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, really should be providing a shared responsibility matrix to you. As their customer, you should have that information so you know what your requirements are. And if a company is not giving you that information, you definitely have some blind spots there. So DIBCAC did not kind of press us for that level of detail. But again, we were using kind of the more standard ones. Granted, you were as well, but we did not have to do that level of detail.
Mm-hmm. At any point, did you ever say the cloud's doing that requirement and I can't see it because they're doing it on their systems, and so I just have to trust that they're doing it?
We did not get into that level of detail. Now I've heard about that, like, say with physical security for the data center. That's something that Microsoft or AWS takes on themselves, and it's not something we can really prove too well unless we get an AWS or Microsoft person on the phone with us.
Right.
So we didn't have to prove any of those things or get into that level of detail with them.
All right. Great info. I really appreciate that. I've been over here taking notes on how to do assessments the DIBCAC way. So any last thoughts?
No, I mean, it went really well. If you happen to get into a DIBCAC assessment, don't panic. They actually are, for the most part, really nice people. They're human like the rest of us, even though they are from the government. You may think they're, lizards in skin suits, but they actually are people deep inside. And it went well. If you take it as a collaborative approach, same with your C3PAO when it's time, or anybody else. If you approach something from a place of working together, you can get a lot more accomplished. And they did give us some good insights and some good advice. We're like, yeah, okay, we agree with you. We should change it this way. So I think it's not a bad thing, and having a third party come out and do an assessment is always a helpful thing. Definitely got us way more ready for CMMC certification. Being ready for that, having gone through it already, knowing how to gather the evidence. We saw it as a positive, both the companies I went through it with.
Yeah, absolutely. Going through the experience myself made me raise the bar on everything that we were doing. Yep. Well, thank you so much, Jake. Appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to posting this all over the place so everybody can see it. Oh,
same here.
Thank you. Yep.
All right. Thanks, Amira.